December 5th, 1945, 5 American military aircraft took to the air on a training mission. The flight was not considered dangerous. The route was well known. The weather caused no concern. They were expected to return within a few hours, and they never did. At first, nothing seemed threatening. The airwaves were clear, the pilots checked in on schedule. The exercise proceeded as it had hundreds of times before. The problems began suddenly. One of the pilots reported that the compass was behaving strangely. Another said he did not recognize the coastline. The commander spoke of an ocean that looked different than usual. Radio communications became fragmented. Words lost their confidence. Coordinates lost their precision. Then, the connection was cut. The search lasted for several days. Ships, aircraft, and hundreds of people were involved. In the area, neither wreckage nor bodies were found, not even traces of a crash. This was not the first such case. Long before that, merchant vessels had vanished in the same region. Captains did not manage to send a distress signal. Logbooks broke off on routine lines. The weather often failed to explain the tragedy. Sometimes the sea was calm. Sometimes the route passed through busy shipping lanes. Sometimes the disappearance occurred in daylight. Rescuers again and again found only water. Over time, assumptions began to appear. Some spoke of a wave that rises suddenly and leaves no time for rescue. Some suggested that the ocean could lose density and swallow a ship without a sound. Others focused on instruments, on compasses that drift, on navigational malfunctions, on disorientation that arises without an apparent cause. There were also those who looked not at the water, but at the sky. They spoke of failures in aviation, of space behaving unpredictably. And some went even further. They spoke of unknown forces, of portals, of places where familiar laws cease to operate. All of this sounded excessive, but each new disappearance forced a return to the same questions. Points appeared on maps. Lines began to be drawn between them. People searched for form in what had no explanation. Thus, a name emerged: the Bermuda Triangle. It united real tragedies, human errors, rare natural phenomena, and fear of emptiness. A place where ships and aircraft vanished. A place that long remained without clear answers. This story is only beginning. Ahead are concrete events, documents, testimonies, theories. But all of this grows from one simple fact. Human beings are accustomed to believing that the world obeys rules, and what frightens them most are the places where those rules suddenly cease to be obvious. This flight did not become known because of a catastrophe. There was no explosion. There was no impact with the water. There was no moment that could be called an ending. That is precisely what made it dangerous to understand. In most accidents, there is a final point, an event after which everything becomes the past. Here, there was no such point. There was only a process that never reached completion. The training flight did not turn into a problem instantly, not because of a sudden change in circumstances, but because of a gradual erosion of confidence. When instruments begin to show different readings, a person is forced into a choice for which no manual can truly prepare them: to trust the technology or to trust their own perception of space. In this flight, neither option offered solid ground. The compass lost its clarity. Visual landmarks no longer confirmed expectations. The coastline ceased to be an argument. The sun ceased to be a guarantee. In the air above the ocean, such doubts carry a different weight. There is no way to stop here, no external vantage point. Every decision takes effect immediately and cannot be tested. The most dangerous thing in this situation is not a wrong course, It is the delay in making a choice. The longer uncertainty lasts, the faster the margin for correction disappears. Fuel is consumed regardless of confidence. Time passes regardless of doubt. The final messages did not sound like panic. There was no shouting, no chaos. There was something else, caution in phrasing. That caution often signals the loss of an internal map of space, a moment when a person is no longer certain that their words correspond to reality. After communication was lost, the event had not yet become a legend. It remained a search problem. But the search produced no result. There were no wreckage fragments, no coordinates, no signs that could restore a timeline. The aircraft involved in the rescue operation also disappeared. This did not add new facts, but it added doubt. The event lost the status of an isolated incident. It ceased to be merely a military matter and became an example of a situation in which technology, experience, and logic failed to place a full stop. In the final reports, words appeared disorientation and navigation error. These terms explain the mechanism, but they do not fill the void because they do not answer the central question, not what happened, but why, within a controlled space, a disappearance without traces or closure proved possible. From this moment on, the flight ceases to be just an event. It becomes a point where doubt in instruments turns into doubt in the stability of space itself. And from there, the story no longer follows aircraft routes. It follows the route of human perception toward a place where individual failures begin to assemble into a sense of pattern. The sea rarely gives warning, especially when it appears calm. This is precisely where one of its greatest dangers lies. Many disappearances in this region were not accompanied by storms. There was no thunder. There were no dark clouds. There were no signals that would have forced a captain to change course or speed. Vessels moved along their usual routes. The waves were moderate. The wind was predictable. And then something changed. Not abruptly, not dramatically. Sometimes it was not even captured in words. The sea could suddenly rise, not like a storm, but like a single wall of water, without long preparation, without a series of warning waves. Such a wave does not break a vessel gradually. It engulfs it, overloads the hull, knocks it off course, and leaves very little time to react. For a long time, such accounts were considered exaggerations, seafaring tales, an all too convenient explanation for accidents without witnesses. But sailors from different regions described similar scenes: one wave, a brief impact, and the feeling that the sea had suddenly become something else. Sometimes, instead of a wave, something different was described, as if the water beneath the vessel lost its support, as if the surface ceased to bear weight. The ship did not capsize. It seemed to sink, slowly or suddenly, without the characteristic noise of destruction. Such descriptions seemed strange. Water either holds or it does not. A third state is not supposed to exist. It was precisely here that a sense of discrepancy appeared, between how people imagine the sea and how it actually behaves. In old Atlantic maritime legends, there is the image of living water, water that breathes, water that can change its properties, not forever, for a moment. These legends did not attempt to be precise. They did not explain a mechanism. They recorded a sensation. A person stands on the deck. Everything around is familiar, and suddenly the support disappears. To the modern mind, such images sound overly poetic, but it is precisely poetry that often preserves what does not yet have a formula. Later, science would attempt to explain such phenomena. Terms would appear, models would appear, observations proving that the ocean is capable of brief but extreme states. However, at the moment a vessel disappears, these explanations do not exist. There is only a sharp change in the situation and a lack of time. It is precisely this lack of time that unites most such stories. There was no prolonged disaster. There was no gradual development of an avaria. Everything happened faster than a person could comprehend. After that, only water remained, and a question that cannot be answered while looking at the smooth surface of the ocean. The sea does not appear guilty. It does not display consequences. It leaves no traces of struggle. That is why legends arise so easily in such cases. Because when the cause is not obvious, imagination fills the void. Some speak of the elements, some of the ocean's vengeance, some of zones where water behaves differently. All these versions share one thing. They are born after the event, when the vessel is already gone. And the more such disappearances accumulate, the stronger the feeling becomes that in this region the ocean does not always act according to expected rules. This is not yet an explanation. It is only the first shift, a shift toward the thought that danger may be hidden not in a storm, but in a brief, almost imperceptible change in the state of the environment. And it is from this point that the next question begins to emerge. If water is capable of behaving so unpredictably, what else might rise from the depths, leaving behind nothing but emptiness? The ocean is not only a surface. Most of it is hidden from view. And it is there, in the darkness, that processes occur which are hard to imagine while standing on a ship's deck. The Atlantic seabed is complex and uneven. There are deep basins, faults, zones where the ground beneath the water is unstable. In such places, gases accumulate. They remain trapped in sedimentary layers for years, invisible, silent. Sometimes these gases escape, not slowly, not evenly, but suddenly. When a large volume of gas rises from the seabed, the water changes. It loses density. It ceases to be the medium for which a ship's hull is designed. In theory, this does not last long, minutes, sometimes seconds, but that is enough. A vessel that finds itself above such a zone does not have time to send a signal, does not have time to change course, does not have time to explain what is happening. To an outside observer, this looks like a disappearance. For a long time, such an idea seemed too radical. It sounded too convenient, too universal. But it did not arise from nothing. Long before scientific terminology, sailors described strange sensations: a smell, bubbles on the surface, a sudden change in the color of the water. In old Atlantic tales, the sea sometimes breathed. It rose, it fell, as if something were moving beneath the surface. These stories were not taken as warnings. They were recorded as odd observations, as incidental details. Only later did they begin to form an image. In legends, this phenomenon was explained in its own way. They spoke of sea creatures, of sleeping forces, of depths that do not tolerate human presence. The myth did not try to prove, it tried to warn. Science, in turn, searched for a mechanism. It did not deny the possibility, it merely clarified the conditions. Such releases do not occur every day. They are rare, localized, and difficult to predict. It is precisely their rarity that makes them dangerous, because no one prepares for them. For a captain who sees a calm surface, there is no reason for alarm. Instruments silent. The sea appears stable. But stability exists only at the level of the eyes. When a disappearance happens quickly and without witnesses, the human imagination searches for an explanation within the visible world and does not find it. Then another explanation emerges, one that does not require proof, one that accepts the unknown as an active force. Thus, depth becomes an image, a place where not only a ship disappears, but confidence as well. And the more such stories accumulate, the stronger it seems that danger comes not from the horizon, but from below. But even this version does not answer all questions. Because if the threat is hidden beneath the water, why do those sometimes disappear as well who are above it, in the air? This question slowly shifts the conversation from the depths into space, to where landmarks should be obvious and where error seems less likely. It is precisely there that another story begins. A human entrusted direction to a small mechanism, to a thin needle oscillating above marked divisions, the compass. It seems simple, reliable, almost eternal. That is why its betrayal is felt so sharply. Many stories in this region begin the same way. A captain looks at the instruments and sees something that does not match reality. The course appears correct, but the coast does not appear. Time passes. The distance should be decreasing, yet space behaves differently. A compass does not always break. More often, it merely deviates by a few degrees. At first glance, a trifle. In the open ocean, trifles do not exist. A few degrees multiplied by hours of flight or sailing turn into dozens of kilometers. And the longer a person trusts the needle, the farther they drift from the expected point. In the region later called the Bermuda Triangle, Earth's magnetic field behaves in a complex way. Different influences intersect here. Here, the needle does not always point where a person is accustomed to looking. For an experienced navigator, this is not a sensation, but for someone who expects stability, it creates an inner conflict. The eyes see one thing, the instruments show another. In such conditions, a person is forced to choose what to trust. Some captains changed course. Some tried to compensate for the deviation. Some continued moving on, hoping the needle would correct itself. It is precisely at this stage that a dangerous pause arises, when the decision can still be changed, but confidence has already been shaken. In old maritime lore, there is an image of a lost direction, places where north is not north, where the way back does not repeat the way forward. These stories did not speak of magnetic fields, they spoke of the loss of an orienter. A person moves correctly, but arrives somewhere else. For modern science, this is a description of a phenomenon. For a person at sea, it is the feeling of a trap. This is especially dangerous for aviation. In the air, there are no coastlines, no waves by which to judge movement. There are only instruments. When they begin to contradict one another, the pilot is forced to make decisions under uncertainty. It is here that disorientation is born, not as panic, but as a gradual loss of confidence. The longer this state lasts, the harder it becomes to return to simple decisions. A person begins to doubt not only the instruments, but their own sensations as well. In such a state, even the correct course may seem wrong. Myths quickly seized upon this feature. Stories appeared about cursed directions, about regions where sky and earth do not agree with each other. In these legends, the compass needle does not merely lie, it serves someone else. Science does not support such notions. It speaks of the complexity of the field, of variations, of the need for corrections.
But between theory and practice lies the human factor. At the moment a person loses orientation, space becomes hostile, even if it has not objectively changed. That is why so many stories in this region are connected not with catastrophe, but with confusion. The vessel does not sink at once. The aircraft does not fall instantly. They move for a long time in the wrong direction, and when fuel or time runs out, correcting the mistake is no longer possible. After that, once again, only water remains, or air, and a question that is hard to answer from the shore. Was it the betrayal of instruments, or human error, or a combination of both, or something that has not yet received its precise definition? This doubt slowly leads further, to where even the sky ceases to be a reliable guide, and where the problem is no longer the needle, but the very perception of space itself.
In the air, a human being is even more dependent on trust. There is no surface that supports you, no traces left behind. There is only movement through space that has no visible boundaries. A pilot is accustomed to relying on instruments. They replace the horizon. They replace the sense of balance. They replace intuition. As long as all indicators agree with one another, the flight feels controlled. Problems begin when space stops confirming expectations. Over the ocean, this happens more often. There are no landmarks, no contrast between sky and earth. The horizon line can disappear. Under such conditions, even an experienced pilot can lose spatial awareness. Not abruptly, gradually. The aircraft is flying level, but it feels as if it is banked. The instruments say one thing, the body feels another. This conflict is dangerous. The human brain is not adapted to prolonged absence of visual cues. It begins to invent, to adjust reality to its own sensations. This is how disorientation arises, not as fear, but as a perceptual error. A pilot may unconsciously change the aircraft's attitude, correcting an imagined tilt and creating a real one. In calm conditions, this is detected quickly. Over the ocean, not necessarily. In some areas of the Atlantic, another factor is added. Weather can change locally, rapidly, without warning. Fog, low cloud cover, walls of rain that appear and disappear. From a distance, they do not look dangerous, but they erase space. In old aviation reports, a strange sensation is sometimes mentioned, as if the aircraft were inside a confined volume, as if the sky had drawn closer. These words are not technical. They describe a state. Such states are the hardest to document. They leave no traces. They are not visible on radar. When an aircraft disappears from screens, only the last marker remains, the last signal. After that, space becomes silent. In myths, this silence was interpreted in different ways. They spoke of a tear in the sky, of zones where the air does not support, of passages between worlds. These images seem excessive, but they do not arise from pure imagination. They arise from experience without explanations. When a person loses landmarks, they search for meaning not in instruments, but in stories, especially when technology is considered safe and the outcome is disappearance. For science, disorientation is a known problem. For myth, it is proof of interference. Between these two approaches lies human fear. Not fear of falling, but fear of losing control. That is why stories of disappearances in the air sound stronger than maritime ones, because air is considered the space where humanity has already defeated the elements. When a failure occurs even there, a feeling arises that the issue is not only technical.
Thus, the next layer of the narrative is formed. When individual phenomena are no longer perceived in isolation, when waves, gas, the compass, and the sky begin to seem like parts of a single picture, a picture in which the problem is not in a single error, but in an excess of explanations. From this moment, the story shifts from attempts to understand the phenomenon to attempts to understand the human being. And here, a question arises that becomes decisive. What happens when there are so many explanations that they begin to interfere with one another?
At first, disappearances are perceived as isolated events. One flight, one vessel, one route. Each case is given its own explanation: navigational error, weather, technical malfunction. This seems logical, and it is sufficient while there are few cases. But over time, their number grows, and then explanations begin to pile up. Some contradict others. Some appear convincing only on their own. Together, they create noise. Within this noise, it becomes difficult to distinguish what is essential from what is secondary. Each new version claims the truth. Each previous one does not disappear. Thus, a feeling arises the truth is not increasing, it is diminishing. Scientific hypotheses speak about the nature of the environment, about complex interactions, about rare but possible phenomena. Semi-scientific versions add assumptions. They do not deny facts, but they stretch them to their limits. Erroneous explanations do not attempt verification. They work with emotions, with fear, with the expectation of sensation. All these levels exist simultaneously, and the listener or reader rarely distinguishes between them. It is precisely at this moment that myth is born, not as fabrication, but as a system. Myth combines disparate explanations into a single story. It does not demand precision, it offers wholeness. It is easier for a person to accept one great mystery than a dozen small ones that do not align with one another. Myth removes the tension of choice. It allows one to say, something special operates here. Within such a formula, there is no need to delve into details, no need to compare reports, no need to acknowledge mistakes. It is enough to accept that the region is dangerous in itself. From this moment on, facts begin to function differently. They no longer seek explanation, they confirm an image already formed. Each new disappearance is perceived as proof, even if it has an obvious cause. Statistics cease to be neutral, they become an argument. Events that do not fit the image are ignored, those that do fit are emphasized. This is how human perception works. It strives for completeness. Myth provides that completeness, even if it is false. That is why in the history of the Bermuda Triangle, incompatible versions coexist so easily. Gas and magnetic fields, waves and portals, errors and interference by the unknown. All of them become parts of a single narrative. Over time, this narrative begins to live its own life. It is repeated, simplified, embellished. It becomes convenient. And the more convenient an explanation is, the less need there is to return to primary sources. It is precisely here that the story makes another turn. It moves away from events and draws closer to the human being. Because it becomes obvious that the key problem lies not only in the ocean, not only in the sky, and not only in instruments. It lies in how people respond to uncertainty, and in how easily we replace complex understanding with a simple but attractive mystery. From this point on, the Bermuda Triangle ceases to be merely a place. It becomes an idea. And ideas, unlike ships and aircraft, do not sink and do not fall. They spread. In most stories about disappearances, there is a common element that for a long time remained in the background: the human being. Not as a hero, not as a victim of the elements, but as a participant in a system that has limits.
Technology creates the illusion of control. Instruments seem precise. Procedures appear well calibrated. But between the instrument and the decision, there is always a human being. A sailor or a pilot does not work in a laboratory. He works under conditions of time, pressure, and responsibility, often in fatigue, long watches, monotony, a flat horizon line that does not change for hours. Under such conditions, attention dulls, reactions slow. Decisions are not worse, they are different. A person begins to rely on habit, on previous experience, on the expectation that the situation will develop as it always has. That expectation often becomes a trap. When an instrument shows something strange, the first reaction is doubt, not in the root, but in the reading itself. This is rational, but not always correct. Many reports testify to a similar scenario: a slight deviation, an attempt to correct it, another adjustment. Each step seems logical. Together, they lead farther and farther away. Stress intensifies this process. It narrows the field of attention. A person sees only what confirms their decision and ignores what contradicts it. In the air, this effect is stronger. The body does not feel speed as it does on the ground. There is no direct feedback. An error can persist for a long time. By the time it is recognized, time has already been lost. In maritime accounts, this moment is described strangely. The captain seems to hesitate. He does not panic, but he also does not act decisively. This state is difficult to convey in dry words. It lies between confidence and doubt. In legends, this was explained differently. They spoke of a loss of will, of an influence that deprives one of decisiveness, of a force that makes one doubt the obvious. Myth gave this state an external cause, because that is simpler. It is far more difficult to acknowledge that the human psyche has limits, and that under certain conditions it begins to work against the human being. Science calls this cognitive distortions. Myth calls it interference. Both speak of the same thing, but in different languages. It is precisely here that the story of the Bermuda Triangle ceases to be a story about a place. It becomes a story about choice, a choice made under conditions of uncertainty. And the more such choices accumulate, the easier it becomes to see a pattern. Disappearances are rarely the result of a single factor. More often, they are a chain, a minor natural phenomenon, a slight deviation of an instrument, fatigue, doubt, a decision made a little later than necessary. Each element on its own does not look fatal. Together, they become irreversible. After that, only the result remains, and it always looks simpler than the path that led to it. That is why the human factor long remained an unpopular explanation. It contains no sensation, it creates no mysticism, but it raises the most uncomfortable question. Do we really control space as well as we think we do? This question has no quick answer, and that is why it is so often answered not with facts, but with symbols. Thus arises the need for something greater than a simple mistake, for something that explains everything at once. It is from this need that the next element of the story grows, an attempt to give chaos a shape and fear a geometry.
When there are too many events, a person begins to arrange them, not by causes, by form. Points appear on maps, places of disappearance, coordinates of last contact, search areas without results. At first, these are just markers, a working tool, an attempt not to get lost in a mass of information. But with time, lines begin to be drawn between the points. A line is already an interpretation. It connects events, even if they are not directly related. When there are several such lines, a figure emerges, A triangle. It looks convincing. A closed shape, clear boundaries, visual completeness. In the human mind, a triangle is not a neutral sign. It is a symbol, a stable form, an archetype. In different cultures, the triangle has meant power, balance, threat, a sacred boundary. When disappearances began to be fitted into this form, they ceased to be separate tragedies. They became elements of a scheme. A scheme is calming, even if it explains nothing. From this moment, the question changes, not why did it happen, but why here? Lines on a map create an illusion of selectivity, as if space itself chooses its victims. But these lines do not exist in nature. They are not felt at sea. They are not recorded in the air. They do not exist for a ship. They do not exist for an aircraft. They exist only for the one who looks from the outside. The scientific approach does not recognize such boundaries. For it, conditions matter, processes, probabilities. Myth thinks differently. It needs a border, a place of transition, a zone of exception. That is why geometry so easily became part of the legend. It gave a sense of control over chaos. Within the triangle, everything looks logical, even the illogical. Disappearances inside are expected. Disappearances outside are accidental. This division has no statistical foundation, but it has a psychological one. It is easier for a person to fear a specific place than to admit that risk is distributed unevenly, but without clear borders. Over time, the triangle ceases to be an analytical tool. It becomes a sign. It begins to be mentioned even before an event, as if the very name already carries a warning. The place acquires a reputation, and reputation begins to influence perception. Any incident within the figure is perceived differently than the same one outside it. Thus, a closed loop is formed. Events reinforce the image reinforces the events. Geometry, which was meant to help understanding, begins to replace understanding. And the more often the name is repeated, the less important the details become. The triangle lives its own life. It no longer needs proof. But behind this form there are still real people, real decisions, real mistakes and coincidences. Lines on a map do not show this, they only mask complexity. That is why the next stage of the story is no longer connected with the sea, nor with the sky, nor with the compass. It is connected with how this form began to spread, how it went beyond maps and became part of the mass imagination. When a story takes shape, it needs a voice. That voice becomes the media. At first, articles, short notes, reports of disappearances without details. They do not create sensation, they merely record a fact. But over time, the tone changes. Events begin to be grouped, compared. Common elements are highlighted. Headlines appear. They contain more emotion than data, more assumptions than verification. What was once separate tragedies turns into a series. A series is always more attractive than a single case. Books devoted to mysterious disappearances are published one after another. Authors rarely work with archives, more often with already published materials. Facts are repeated. Errors multiply. Inaccuracies become details of the plot. The media do not invent from nothing. They select, they amplify, they omit what is inconvenient. Context disappears. Effect remains. Television adds imagery, a dark sea, ominous music, a voiceover that does not hurry with answers. Mystery becomes a product. In this format, it does not matter how rare a phenomenon is. What matters is that it looks regular.
It does not matter how many cases have explanations. What matters is that a few remain without them. It is precisely these few that become the foundation of the narrative. The media create a sense of presence. The viewer seems to be inside the event. But this presence is selective. What does not fit the story remains off-screen. Gradually, the Bermuda Triangle ceases to be a geographical concept. It becomes a plot. It is used in films, in television series, in novels. Each new interpretation adds a layer, not of knowledge, of imagination. The image takes root. It becomes familiar to even those who have never opened a map of the Atlantic. From this moment on, real events can no longer compete with invented ones. They sound weaker, more ordinary. The myth wins not because it is more convincing, but because it is more interesting. And the more it is talked about, the harder it becomes to return to dry reports. The media are not obliged to provide answers. Their task is to hold attention, and attention is held by mystery. That is why even those versions that do not withstand scrutiny continue to exist. They live not thanks to evidence, but thanks to repetition. Over time, the viewer stops asking questions. They accept the image as a given. The Bermuda Triangle becomes a place where something happens. What exactly is no longer so important. But behind this convenience lies a problem. When a myth becomes too loud, it begins to drown out reality. What could have explained events loses the chance to be heard. And it is here that the need arises to look not at what was told, but at what people preferred to remain silent about.
When a story is repeated many times, it gradually loses part of its meaning. Not because it is deliberately hidden, but because it does not work toward tension. What always remains off-screen is what does not create a sense of exceptionality. Statistics have no voice. They do not evoke emotion. They do not build a plot. But it is precisely statistics that show how rare events really are and how typical they may be. For decades, thousands of vessels passed through this area of the Atlantic, every day, every year. Some of the busiest sea routes in the world ran through here. Commercial, military, passenger. Most of them reached their destinations without incident, without failures, without mysteries. These voyages did not become news. No books were written about them. They were not mentioned in films. They simply took place. The same applies to aviation. The number of flights over this region increased with each decade, and the more flights there were, the larger the absolute number of accidents appeared. But the relative rate remained comparable to other challenging regions of the world. This fact does not destroy the myth. It simply does not fit into it. Explained cases also remained off-screen. Those where wreckage was found, those where a cause was established. They were not included in the overall picture because they reduced tension. Instead, attention focused on a few incidents that for various reasons did not provide complete information. The absence of data was perceived as the presence of mystery. It was also rarely mentioned that conditions in this region are objectively complex. Intersecting currents, unstable weather, great depth. This is not unique, but it is sufficient to increase risk. Even more rarely discussed were changes in standards, how navigation systems improved, how forecast accuracy increased. Disappearances became less likely, but the myth did not notice this. It already lived in the past, in a time when communication was limited, when searches took days, when the absence of a response was perceived as something exceptional. Modern satellites see more. Radars cover space,
Communication is almost continuous. But these achievements do not create a story. They contain no mystery. One more thing also remained off-screen: how human behavior changes when a name is heard. A crew that knows a place's reputation becomes more vigilant, more tense. Sometimes this helps, sometimes it interferes. The expectation of danger can distort decisions just as much as its absence. This is not spoken of in legends, because legend requires an external force. Here, one must look within. When the effect of editing is removed from the story, what remains is a complex, uneven, unfinished picture, without clear boundaries, without shapes, without a single culprit. This is uncomfortable, but this is what reality looks like. And yet, even knowing this, people are in no hurry to abandon the myth, because myth provides a sense of order, even if that order is imaginary. That is why the next step of the story is not in refutation, nor in proof, but in understanding why, even after all explanations, the Bermuda Triangle continues to exist as a symbol.
Facts have one distinctive feature. They do not linger in memory for long, especially when they do not evoke strong emotions. Myth works differently. It does not explain, it imprints itself. When new data appears, the myth does not disappear, it changes shape. Scientific reports accumulate, maps are refined, models become more precise, but the image remains. The reason is not a lack of information. There is, in fact, more of it than ever. The reason lies in the fact that people rarely perceive the world as a set of probabilities. They need stories. The Bermuda Triangle became precisely such a story. It combined fear of the elements, mistrust of technology, and anxiety before the invisible. Each new fact is either incorporated into this framework or ignored. Even refutation works in favor of the myth, because it once again draws attention to the topic. People do not hear arguments, they hear the name. And the name long ago ceased to be geographical. It became a symbol of a zone where something can go wrong. Such zones exist in every culture, in the mountains, in deserts, in the seas. They change along with technology, but the principle remains. As the world becomes more understandable, the need grows for places that remain incomprehensible. The Bermuda Triangle filled this niche in the era of radar, satellites, and global navigation. It reminded us that total control is an illusion. That is why the myth did not vanish after new data appeared. It adapted. Instead of old explanations, new ones emerged. Where curses were once mentioned, energies began to be discussed. Where gods were invoked, dimensions began to be invoked. Words change, structure does not. Myth always finds a language that matches its era. In this sense, it is more alive than facts. A fact belongs to its time. A myth is timeless. That is why attempts to dismantle the legend often meet resistance. People defend not a statement, they defend a feeling. The feeling that the world cannot be reduced to formulas, and that there is still space within it for wonder, for anxiety, and for boundaries. Here, the story of the Bermuda Triangle moves beyond the ocean. It becomes a conversation about how we choose what to believe, and why even convincing explanations do not always have power over imagination. But before drawing final conclusions, it is worth looking at what this region looks like today. Not in legends, but in reality. Precisely there, where myth and fact exist side by side. Today, this region looks different. Not because the ocean has changed, but because the human being has. Satellites constantly monitor the ocean's surface. Navigation systems operate continuously. Communication rarely disappears completely. Routes are planned with currents and weather in mind. Forecasts are updated hourly. Coordinates are refined to the meter. For a modern vessel, this space is not exceptional. It is complex, but predictable. Aviation has changed as well. Flights are controlled by several systems simultaneously. Even in the absence of visual landmarks, an aircraft is not left without information. Disappearances like those that formed the basis of the legend are becoming increasingly rare. But the myth does not respond to frequency. It responds to the mere fact of possibility. Despite technological progress, people have not stopped disappearing. It simply happens differently now. Failures are recorded more often. Errors are identified more quickly. Events have a chronology. This reduces the space for imagination, but it does not eliminate it entirely. Because even in the 21st century, there are situations in which data contradict one another, when communication is interrupted, when decisions are made under time pressure. And it is precisely in these moments that the name resurfaces. It does not require proof. It functions as a marker of risk. A person hears it and becomes more attentive, or, on the contrary, more tense. Modern research finds no unique anomalies that would make this region fundamentally more dangerous than others, but it does not deny complexity either. Here, as before, currents intersect. Weather changes locally. Depth complicates search operations. This is not a mystery. These are conditions. The difference between past and present lies in the fact that today these conditions are taken into account. Previously, they were not. This explains why most legendary cases belong to a specific period, not to a place, but to a time of limited technology, a time of fragmented data, a time when silence meant danger. Today, silence less often remains empty. But even now, people are not ready to abandon the idea of a zone of exception, because to admit that the world has become more predictable means to take on greater responsibility, and responsibility frightens more than myth. That is why the Bermuda Triangle exists in parallel with reality. It no longer determines routes, but it determines mood, and that is enough for it to remain alive. Debunking does not necessarily mean destruction. Sometimes it means a change of scale. Science rarely works with absolutes. It does not say never, it says with a certain probability. This is precisely what makes it uncomfortable for myth. When scientists began to analyze events systematically, it became clear that each of them has context, time, weather conditions, the state of technology, human decisions. No disappearance existed in a vacuum. What looked like an anomaly often turned out to be a combination of factors, rare but possible. The ocean is capable of brief extreme states, the air of disorientation, the magnetic field of deviation. This is not a sensation. These are properties of a complex system. Debunking does not begin with denying the myth, but with clarifying boundaries, where statistically expected outcomes end and where interpretation begins. When these boundaries become visible, the mystery does not disappear. It loses its universality.
the Bermuda Triangle ceases to be a place where anything is possible. It becomes a place where slightly more is possible than people are comfortable admitting. Science does not strip the legend of its power, it changes its nature. Instead of an external enemy, the complexity of the world appears. This is less spectacular, but far more accurate. That is why many people do not accept such debunking. It offers no emotional finale. There is no culprit, there is no curse, there is no single cause. There is only interaction. For myth, this sounds like defeat. For understanding, like a step forward. Debunking without destruction allows the story to be preserved, but changes the way it is heard, not as a warning about a zone of death, but as a reminder of the limits of control. In this form, the Bermuda Triangle ceases to be an exception. It becomes an example of how human imagination works with uncertainty and how difficult it is to accept a world in which not everything has a single answer. It is precisely this understanding that opens the path to the final sections, those in which the story returns not to the ocean, but to the human being. A myth rarely arises where everything is clear. It appears at a boundary. At the boundary between knowledge and experience. At the boundary between control and helplessness. The Bermuda Triangle became such a myth not by accident and not instantly. It emerged in an era when humanity began to believe that the world had been fully mastered. Radio connected continents, aviation shortened distances, navigation seemed precise, and suddenly disappearances. Not mass catastrophes, not obvious tragedies, but disappearances without explanations. They shattered the sense of completeness. The myth became a way to restore balance. It said, this is not a system failure. This is a special place. Such an explanation eased part of the anxiety, because if danger is localized, it can be bypassed, even if this is only an illusion. The myth also removed responsibility. When an event is explained by an external force, human error recedes into the background. This is psychologically understandable. It is far more difficult to accept that experienced people, under complex conditions, can make mistakes, that technology does not guarantee safety, that control is always relative. The myth allows this realization to be avoided. It creates distance between the human being and randomness. Culture readily supports such constructs. They are resilient, they are transmitted, they adapt. In every era, myth speaks the language of its time. Once it was curses and gods, later magnetic fields and anomalies, later still portals and dimensions. The form changes, the function does not. Myth gives meaning where it is difficult to find quickly. And even when an explanation appears, it does not disappear, because explanations work with the mind, and myth works with feelings. The Bermuda Triangle became a convenient image for all fears connected with space, the sea, the sky, the unknown. It does not require precise coordinates. It exists as a warning. That is why this legend did not collapse under the pressure of facts. It was necessary. Not for the ocean, not for science, for the human being. And as long as people confront the limits of their own control, such myths will arise again, under different names, in other places, but with the same function. This realization does not diminish the story of the Bermuda Triangle. On the contrary, it makes it universal. All that remains is to take the final step, to return to the beginning, and to look at this entire story, not as a mystery of a place, but as a mirror.
Every story has a point where questions stop demanding answers, not because there is no answer, but because it no longer changes what matters most. The Bermuda Triangle began as a series of separate events: missing ships, missing aircraft, a broken signal. Over time, these events were brought together. They were given a shape. They were given a name. Thus, a mystery was born. But with time, it became clear that the true boundary does not run through the ocean, nor through the sky. It runs through the way human beings look at the unknown, between the desire to understand and the need to believe, between analysis and imagination, between fact and meaning. The ocean in this region did not become different. It has always been complex, changeable, dangerous under certain conditions. The sky did not become more treacherous. It simply does not tolerate mistakes. Instruments did not become enemies. They only showed how strongly we depend on them. All the elements that were later called anomalies exist in other parts of the world as well. But not every place becomes a symbol. Symbols are born at points where uncertainty meets expectation, where an event has no conclusion, where a story breaks off. Human beings do not tolerate breaks well. They strive to close the line, to give it form. Thus, triangles appear, names, legends. They do not deceive, they reassure. A mystery is not always something hidden. Often it is something we are not yet ready to accept in all its complexity. The world is not hostile, but it is not fully controllable either. Between these two extremes, myths arise. They do not oppose science, they fill the pauses between its statements. The Bermuda Triangle does not require refutation. It has already fulfilled its role. It reminded us that even in the age of satellites and algorithms, human beings remain creatures who seek meaning, not only data. Perhaps that is why this story still resonates today, not as a warning about a specific place, but as a reminder of a boundary between knowledge and the unknown, a boundary we call mystery. And as long as this boundary exists, such stories will not disappear. They will only change their names. And the ocean, as before, will remain the same, calm in appearance, complex in essence, and indifferent to human legends.